Starry River, Chapter 10. The toad looked up at Rindy triumphantly, as if it expected applause. Rindy could only stare. The toad gave another burp, this one sounding a bit offended. It turned away from Rindy and began to gaze at the stone field. It sat listening to the light breeze, its neck strained forward as if a voice was calling to it. Rindy looked at the toad again. It seemed ordinary enough, mold-colored, fat and lumpy. If anything, it was uglier than most toads, but Rindy had never seen a toad act like this. Then, with a clumsy plop, the toad jumped. Hop, plop. It began to make its way toward the stone pancake. It was easy to see that the toad meant to cross it. Rindy quickly moved. "Don't go there, you dumb toad," Rindy said, placing a shovel in front of its path. "It's miles of hot stone. You'll just get lost and cooked." The toad made another insulted-sounding croak, but looked again at Rindy as if reconsidering. Rindy felt curious and impressed at the same time. Then, as if a decision had been made, the toad turned around and hopped to the back door of the inn. "Rip," the toad said loudly. Did you want to go in?" Rindy asked. "Rip, rip," the toad said impatiently. "It's lunchtime anyway," Rindy shrugged and opened the door. The toad began to hop into the inn. Rindy couldn't help following, matching its steps to the toad's jumps. Where was it going? He felt as if were tied to the road. He felt as if he were tied to the toad with an invisible thread. The toad turned toward a room Rindy had never entered before. "I don't think you should go in there, Toad," Rindy said, but the toad was not listening. He disappeared into the room, and Rindy, after hesitating a moment, followed. It was a small dark room, and the light from the doorway poured into it like spilled water. The harsh daylight was softened, diffused by the dusty ashes of incense floating in the air. It skimmed gently over the short, narrow table lined with incense holders, and a row of gray slabs of stone that leaned against the wall. The stone tablets were carved with names of dead ancestors and blackened by smoke. But this was the child's family shrine room. The toad plopped before a tablet and gave a sad, mournful croak, again reminding Rindy of the sad cries he heard from the night sky. Rindy stepped closer and caught his breath as he read the name of Paye's mother. He hadn't really thought about Paye's mother until that moment. He realized, and a sudden guilt filled him. "Everyone leaves," Paye had said, and she had been her mother as well. However, Paye's mother had not only left, but was also never coming back. All that Paye saw of her mother now was a carved name on a cold, dark stone. The toad said. Rindy saw that the toad was leaving the room. He followed. The toad turned into the hallway, leaping confidently. Rindy felt his amusement returning. Hop, plop, hop, plop. Each jump giving a resolute thud, and the toad continued forward with a determined air. As they got closer to the dining room, Rindy could hear people talking. "He's always hungry. He doesn't care about anyone except himself. He hasn't ever smiled or laughed or been nice since he's been here," Paye was saying. "Never smiled?" Madam Chang said thoughtfully. "He's too young to be that troubled." Rindy realized they were talking about him and tried to retreat, but he was too late. "Rip, rip," the toad called loudly, announcing their presence. Everyone turned toward them, and Rindy froze in the entryway. But no one was looking at Rindy. All eyes were on the toad. Despite Master Chow's look of horror, it was gleefully leaping across the floor, making croaking sounds like guffaws of laughter. With a last great joyful spring, the toad bounded into the air and on to Mr. Chan's ragged, unkempt lap. Chapter 11. Rindy looked down at his rice. He wasn't sure if he was more surprised that he was sitting at a dining table reserved for guests, or that Madame Chang was smiling. But instead of being disgusted that a fat toad had landed next to her, Madame Chang beamed as if greeting an old friend. Her welcome had included Rindy, who she insisted to sit with her, Mr. Shan, Pai, and the toad for lunch. Master Chow had shrugged permission. Madame Chang's choice of a chore boy as a dining companion as perplexing to him as her choice of the toad. However, the toad's company seemed to be more appreciated than Rindy's. Pei clapped her hands, and Mr. Shan had brightened and smiled at it, looking more awake and alive than Rindy had ever seen him before. Mr. Shan petted the toad, and then reached into his pocket and took out 2 copper coins tied together with a red string. He rattled it in front of the toad, like a toy in front of a baby. Instead of groaning pitiful sounds like the ones Rindy had heard at night, the toad was now gurgling and giggling. "You're playing with the toad," Rindy said with a note of disgust. Pei rolled her eyes. "It's more fun than you," she said. He began to respond with a rude insult, but suddenly the image of the cold, grim stone tablet came into Rindy's mind. He closed his mouth. "Rindy," Madame Chang said as he paused, "Pei says that you haven't ever smiled since you've been here. Is that true?" Rindy shrugged. "Yesterday, I noticed that you seemed to enjoy my story," Madame Chang said. "Am I right?" Rindy nodded grudgingly. "It was interesting," he said. "Well, I want to make a deal with you," Madame Chang said. If I can make you laugh with this next story, then for every story I tell, you must tell one of your own." "I don't know any stories," Rindy protested. "Oh, I'm sure you do," Madame Chang said, smiling at him in a teasing way. "You've just never shared them before. And I'll give you plenty of time to think of one. You can tell yours at dinner." "I want to hear a funny story," Pei said. Mr. Chan nodded, and the toad croaked as if in agreement. Even Master Chow, standing at the back of the room, seemed to be looking at Rindy. Rindy shrugged again. "Does it have to be a good story?" he asked. "Any story you want," Madame Chang said. "We won't complain." "I will," Pei said, but Madame Chang ignored her. "Is it a deal?" Madame Chang said, looking at Rindy. He hesitated. "Oh, Rindy," Pei said, irritated. "You're not going to laugh anyway." "All right," Rindy said. Why not, he thought. Madame Chang smiled, unexpectedly. She turned her head and looked at Mr. Chow, who had been pretending that their conversation was unworthy of his attention. But it was plain to see that he had been listening closely. He quickly looked away and pushed the beads on his abacus, as if he were in deep calculation. Madame Chang's smile grew larger, and she began the story. The story of the old sage. Once there was an old man who lived on a mountaintop. Some thought he was a crazy old man. Others thought he was the mountain spirit, or even an immortal. But most believed he was a sage of great wisdom. Many sought him, some for answers, some for advice, and some to be his students. The old man answered all the questions and solved all the problems, but he shooed away all hopeful students. However, one student named Taiwu refused to give up. He returned over and over again, begging and pleading until finally the sage agreed to teach him. Taiwu was an eager pupil. At the sun's first light, the sage would share the old stories and teachings, and they would spend the rest of the day in deep contemplation. But at night, when the moon climbed into the sky, the old man ignored his student and instead read to himself from a large book. Tawu wondered about this. It was obvious to him that there was great wisdom in that book that only the sage read. What special knowledge was in it? He yearned to know, but the sage never offered him even a glance at one of the pages. However, Tawu was a reasonable fellow. He will allow me to read the book, he thought, when I have mastered everything else he taught me. So he set his mind on his lessons, learning in earnest. And with such effort, his progress was quite considerable. Soon, when people came to the old sage for answers, Tawu was able to give them. Before long, Tawu began to gain a reputation of being a wise man. Encouraged by this, Tawu finally gathered the courage to ask the sage about the book. One night, as the old man read silently, Tawu asked, "Master, what are you reading in that book?" "The page I'm reading right now," the old man said without looking up, "is about the secret to attaining peace." The secret to peace? Tawu was in awe. Only the wisest and greatest of sages would know that. The book was full of wonderful secrets. What other extraordinary answers were in that book? "Master," Tawu said, "may I read the secret to peace too?" The old man looked at him. "Do you really wish to know the secret to peace?" he asked. "Or do you simply wish to read the book of fortune?" Tawu thought carefully, and then said honestly, "Both." The sage said nothing, stroking his beard in thought. Tawu could sense his doubt. Finally the sage said, "Do you really believe you're ready?" "Yes," Tawu said confidently. In his mind, the only thing that kept him and the sage from being equals was the knowledge in that book. "I'm not sure," the old man said. "I am," Tawu said. "Please, how can I prove it to you?" The sage sat thoughtfully for a moment and then said, "At the bottom of this mountain, you will see a tall tree overlooking a lake. Climb the tree to the highest branch and sit in there, contemplation, for 99 days and nights. If you are able to do that, you may read the Book of Fortune and the secret to achieving peace." Immediately, Tawu traveled down the mountain, and he found the tall tree overlooking the lake. The tree was smooth and straight like a giant paintbrush, and seemed almost as tall as the mountain he had just left. With great difficulty, Tawu wrapped a robe around the trunk of the tree and made his way up to the highest branch. At the top, he sat in complete confidence. He was sure he could meet his master's requirements and return to learn the great secret. The sun rose and dropped. The moon filled and emptied, and Tawu watched it all from the top of the tree. Nearby villagers, finding it easier to call up questions to someone up in a tree rather than climb a mountain, sent him baskets of food, which he hauled up using his rope. Soon he began to bestow answers and advice to a steady stream of followers. On the 96th night, there was a terrible storm. The wind shrieked and screamed, and the thunder's roars echoed for miles away. Lightning slashed the sky, and rain attacked like vicious arrows. The tree swayed and bent, but Tawu, remembering his master's teachings, did not panic. Even as nearby branches crackled and fell, and rain and wind slapped his face raw, he sat silently like a stone statue. The next morning, everyone crowded around the tree to see Tawu sitting up there calmly in the branches. "He is, without a doubt, a great sage," they said to one another. "Only one who has achieved real enlightenment would be unmoved by that storm." And they hailed and honored him from the ground. Tawu heard their praises and felt quite satisfied. "I've truly proven myself," he thought, and wrote a poem. "Like a mountain of stone, the most powerful wind, the most thunderous noise, cannot move me, steadfast in my mind, deliverance my gain." This he decided to send to his master, the old man on the mountain. One of Tawu's admirers quickly brought it to the stage. The old man read the poem and smiled. Then he flipped the paper over and wrote in dark characters, "Burp," and sent it back to Tawu. Tawu quickly read the reply, expecting praise from his teachers. But what he saw was that his master had scrawled on the page instead. Tawu was very insulted. "Burp," he said indignantly. "I speak of sacrifice and great knowledge, and he returns with this? What does he mean?" Offended, Tawu rushed down the tree and up the mountain. With every step he felt more resentful of his master's response. So, when he finally saw the old sage sitting calmly, Tawu immediately began to berate him. "What is this?" he said, waving the message angrily. "Burp! What do you mean?" The old man waited until Tawu paused for breath. "You said that the most powerful wind and the loudest noise could not move you," the sage said with a smile. "But it took only one burp to bring you here." With those words, Madame Chang finished the story and looked at Rindy. His mouth had curved, and a noise snorted out of his nose. It was only when the sound joined everyone else's that he realized that he was laughing. Oh, I like that story. Chapter 12. After lunch, Rindy went to collect water from the half-moon well. Ever since he had arrived at the village of Clear Sky, all his time from lunch until dinner was spent doing this. Rindy walked back and forth on the twisting street between the inn and the well until the sun sat right on the horizon like a balancing egg yolk. The half-moon well was divided by a crumbling stone wall. It had been the wall from a courtyard protecting a wealthy home when the village of Clear Sky was rich and prospering. At that time, the owner must have been generous, for he had dug half the well beyond the wall so that the poor peasants could use it too. To them, the split well had looked like a half circle of the mid-month moon, so they called it Half-Moon Well. However, now, with the wall in ruins, the well looked more like a full moon with a scar down its center. Rindy cursed it daily. The half-moon well was an awkward shape to haul water from. The dividing wall made the openings too small for buckets. Rindy was forced to use a small hollow gourd to draw up the water, which he emptied into the large buckets and carried to and from the inn. Every day, Rindy had to gather enough water for the garden and the inn, and he often felt as if he were trying to fill a lake using a spoon. Today, however, Rindy did not curse the well. He did not think of the whales in the sky that gave him no peace at night. He did not even plot or plan how he would leave the village. Instead, he was busy trying to think of a story to tell at dinner. He tried to remember old fairy tales told to him, or to make one up, but his mind remained empty. "Why did I agree to tell a story?" he groaned to himself. "Why does she want me to tell a story anyway?" So while his head was empty, the rest of him was full of anxiety. Even as he filled the oversized buckets with the gourd, his thoughts were turning and twisting like dough in deep-frying oil. Perhaps that was why, when Rindy had finished the tiring process of filling the buckets, he paid less attention to his feet than he should have. He had just balanced the carrying sticks on his shoulders, still thinking furiously, and stepping over the well, when his back foot caught on the partition wall. In that instant, Rindy tripped. His buckets swung madly like crazed pendulums, splashing water in large waves until everything, including Windy, crashed to the ground. "Ah!" Windy cried. He lay face down on the harsh, dusty earth. Pain flashed through him, and a bump was already forming on the back of his head where one of the buckets had struck him. But it was anger that was burning through Rindy like a hot fire. Already, the spilled water, the water that took him so long to collect, was drying in the sun. "Stupid, stupid wall!" Rindy roared, jumping up and kicking the partition with his foot, resulting in new stabs of pain. With a yelp of anger, he began attacking the wall with all his strength. Boiling rage seemed to have bubbled and burst inside him. His every muscle throbbed with red fury. The air seemed to shriek in his ears, and the fierceness of his anger felt like explosions inside his head. His pole cracked and the buckets bounced from the wall. Rindy still felt as if he were ablaze with 1,000 bee stings. He fell to his knees and grabbed a rock with each hand and raised them to strike. But suddenly, his hands froze in the air and the rocks dropped to the ground. For, unexpectedly, he saw his reflection in the well. The water on both sides of the well mirrored him, showing him in a way he had never seen before, roaring with anger and filled with rage. I look like, Rindy gasped, my father. He felt as if a searing knife had been stabbed into him, the reflections in the water revealing a likeness he almost could not bear. For a moment he was blinded by a mix of memories, pain, and regret. When his vision cleared, Rindy was staring again at 2 images of himself. The faces that looked back at him were troubled and uneasy. He felt tired, as if he had been running for days. Tears stung his eyes. But the water and the stones of the well were still and unmoved, as if they were the empty sky above. To be continued.